Whenever you think of badass game mechanics, what comes to mind? Actually, don't answer that. I can't hear you anyways, unless you put it in the comments. What comes to my mind is the parry, the deflection of an enemy's attack that leads to a perfect opportunity for a counterattack. Comes from the French word parrer, meaning to turn aside or ward off, which was most likely borrowed from the Italian word meaning to prepare, adorn, shield, or keep out. It was often used in a sport called fencing, but being the gamers that we are, we haven't come close to putting on that white jumpsuit and poking the opponent with a pointy stick. I will give a shout out to some of the fencing artwork on the Wikipedia page though. Some truly high quality art there. Did you also know that there are 9 different types of parrying and fencing? Some wild stuff. But anyways, you're not here for a history lesson about some sport. It takes immense skill and timing on the player's part. The mastery of a game's combat system required to pull it off is chef's kiss. Whether it's with swords or a fist or gun, nothing in video games is quite as successful as a parry. I just showed some examples of parries and you might have noticed a common thread. Well, that's because there's no other game series where it's quite as satisfying as the Souls series. And fighting games too. But I don't play a lot of fighting games, so I don't feel qualified to talk about them. I mean, if we were to retrace the lineage of the parry in video games, we'd have to go all the way back to 1994 with, you guessed it, a fighting game, and you guessed it, Samurai Showdown 2. But it was popularized by, you guessed it, another fighting game, and you guessed it again, Street Fighter III. I mean, one of the most important moments in all of esports history happened because of parrying, but sadly, as I said, I'm not qualified to talk about fighting games, having only spent like an hour playing Tekken 5 or some shit. And there are other games that include good parrying like Wulong, Fallen Dynasty, a few of the 3D Legend of Zeldas, and Liza P. is also very popular in hack and slash games like Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, but is probably best known for the Royal Guard style in Devil May Cry. The only real style if you're a true gamer. What makes a good parry though? I'd say Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are perfect examples of S-tier parries. The slowdown, the massive blue effect, and the glorious sound that makes me, you know. And it gives you a nice reward for taking the risk, but it doesn't trivialize the combat. That's an issue that the Souls games, especially Elden Ring, struggle with at times, and I'll get to that later. Of course, there are examples of bad parries in games. Did you know that Hollow Knight has a parry? I sure didn't, despite playing for as long as I have. It's not necessarily bad, but it doesn't factor into the gameplay very much, to the point that you kind of wonder, why is it even there? No, the real bad example is Sonic Frontiers. No timing, very little skill required. I guess considering that Sonic is aimed towards a younger demographic, Sonic Team figured it was better to make it as accessible as possible by sacrificing the things that make a parry satisfying. But that's enough about talking about other series. Let's talk about a series that I have a lot of experience with, the Souls games. And with having that experience, you can trust me when I say parrying in Souls games is one of the most gratifying, yet one of the most infuriating things ever. In the Souls games, you really only have 2 ways of responding to attacks, either by rolling or parrying, and the last one is the one that's important for our discussion today. For the Souls games parries, and for parries in a lot of different games, there are the startup frames, the anticipation, we get real low here, then the active frames where the parrying actually happens if you get hit in this window, and then the recovery frames at the end. If we talk about a numerical value, it varies between games, but the most frames comes from the small shields like the buckler, the primo shield for parries. You can still parry with medium shields, and even though it's not the best for parrying, it does feel quite good to get a parry with a katana. In combat, the required timing is precise, because as you can guess, 10 frames at 60 frames per second is a fairly tight window, not to mention figuring out what attacks can even be parried in the first place, if a boss can be parried at all. Good rule of thumb being that if it's human size and has a weapon, it can most likely be parried. And as you can guess, if you miss the timing, then you take a face full of whatever was coming your way. But you know, the reward is definitely worth the effort of learning the boss movesets, right? For the old Souls games, I would say say yeah, the damage you can deal in with a riposte after you get a successful parry can be ridiculous, especially with daggers. That's what that mystical critical stat is on a weapon. It's a multiplier for the riposte. The damage that enemies do isn't absurdly overtuned yet, so failing isn't as heavily punishing. So that leads us to the most recent Souls game, Elden Ring. I think it's safe to say that Elden Ring is pretty difficult. There is definitely a ballooning of bosses' health and damage as you get into the mountaintops of the giants and beyond. Before then, I'd say learning boss patterns is worth it, since you only need one successful parry to achieve a riposte. As you see, that's where Elden Ring pulls out its trap card. Most bosses nearing the endgame require multiple parries, which increases the opportunities to mess up, and with damage as high as it is, it just doesn't seem worth it to learn the boss's movesets. And hell, even some bosses early on require more than one parry. Parrying is already inherently more risky than rolling, so Elden Ring requiring multiple parries comes off as another way to make the game harder to keep up with players' skill levels. Not to mention the fact that the damage on daggers tends to fall off quite significantly by the end game, unless you're trying to stack as many buffs as possible. The risk associated with parrying is just too great to make it worth it if you are just a casual player of Souls games. And that's all there is to talk about. There definitely isn't another game that I'm forgetting. Well, technically those are called deflections. Okay, fine, I'll talk about Sekiro. But before we get to that, why don't we take a little history field trip? To 1185 all the way to 1868, which is known as the Age of the Samurai. Now I know that history isn't fun, but this is ninja history, so that should be an exception. We're not going to go too in deep to it because I'm not qualified to, being a white boy from the Midwest, but let's just go over the characteristics of the samurai. And if you've done like any history lessons on the samurai, you know that they weren't exactly the most honorable people out there. Despite being aristocratic warriors, committed, sorry if I were to butcher this horribly, like I said, white boy, to tsugiri, which translates to a roadside killing, pretty much to test out new weapons they'd acquired during the Sengoku period, which was known for being an era of civil wars. And would you look at that, Sekiro Styles Die Twice actually takes place around that period. And if you've played the game, you would know that Wolf isn't even a samurai, he's a shinobi, which is even worse in terms of honor, as they acted as assassins that participated in infiltration and reconnaissance. So there wasn't necessarily a whole lot of sword fighting going on, but let's not worry about that. Now it's time to actually talk about Sekiro, the creme de creme of deflections and parrying in video games. When a game based around parrying comes up, this is usually the one, for very good reason. It captures the fantasy of being a shinobi perfectly with its tight sword play, often described as a dance, or more accurately Simon Says, it's just Simon Says. You deflect normal attacks and give the appropriate response when there are perilous attacks. Perilous attacks require jumps for sweeping attacks, or the Makiri counter for stab attacks. Now, jumping and the Makiri counter don't sound like parries, but remember what parry means: to ward off or turn aside. And what do you do with the Makiri counter? Yep, that looks like warding off an enemy's attack to me. That's the name of the game. The back and forth of deflections that determine the speed of the fight. Wait a minute, did I just say fight? Oh, did I forget to tell you that there's parrying in fighting games? I'm sorry. I'm serious though. Like, oh my god, there's so many of them. Eventually, it just becomes second nature within the player's skill. But the sparks and the sounds, which is the katana sound from Dark Souls 1, go a long way in keeping it fresh. Those are the big important parts about making a good parry in Sekiro and other Souls games. Pass those tests with flying colors. I do think the Souls series and Bloodborne, yeah, I finally brought up Bloodborne, don't ever lose their parrying goodness, as it's only one style of play in those games, while Sekiro, it's the central part of the combat system, and just by repetition, it doesn't take nearly as long as a good So yeah, that's what I have to say about parrying. Not to mention all the other games that have parrying, including Ninja Gaiden, Metroid Dread, the Resident Evil 4 remake, Ghost of Tsushima, Fury, Neo 1 and 2, Dragon's Dogma, Star Wars, Jedi, Survivor, Final Fantasy 16, Pizza Tower, God of War 2018 and Ragnarok, Blasphemous, Astral Chain, The Surge, Cuphead, Salt and Sanctuary, Tekken 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, probably 8, Parry Sword Adventure, Re-Parry, Purple Chicken Spaceman, The Duelist Wizard, Sekiro Style Combat,